Good evening and good morning wherever you are in the world. I'm Denisha Rajendran, and I'm moderating the 11th YouTube session of the 6th fall edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 14 award-winning best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking. We'll be telling you more about the For Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later in the session. And you can find out about the Pixel Project by visiting www.thepixelproject.net. But firstly, today we have a very, very special guest with us today. For our live Read for Pixels discussion and Q&A session, the fabulous award-winning science fiction and fantasy author, A.M. Dellamonica. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Hi, thanks for having me. Thanks so much for having me and for rescheduling after last week kind of went pear-shaped.
Yeah. Alex's first novel, Indigo Springs, won the Sunburst Award for Canadian Literature of the Fantastic. The fourth, A Daughter of No Nation, won the 2016 Prix Aurora. They have over 40 short stories in print and teaches writing at 2 universities while pursuing an MFA in creative writing at a third. Alex has also generously donated a couple of awesome goodies to the stash of author goodies we have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page, including goodie number 1, the Hidden Sea Tales first edition book bundle. Alex has put together a first edition hardcover bundle for one US or Canada-based Read for Pixels donor, including...
Should I be doing this? Okay, great. I'm just bad at this camera thing.
No worries. One signed and personalized copy of A Daughter of No Nation and one signed and personalized copy of The Nature of a Pirate. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. This book bundle is the perfect gateway to Alex's series and an intense and thoughtful read for donors looking for an imaginative and beautifully written book. And tackle issues ranging from women's rights to climate change head-on. There is only one of this book bundle ready for you to get your mitts on. Just donate $75 and Alex will get busy signing and personalizing them for you and sending them directly to you. Goodie number 2, A.M. Dellamonica's critiquing 20 pages of your work in progress. So, Alex, you're quite known for your teaching, aren't you?
I've been, I went to Clarion West in Seattle quite a few years ago, and I have been actively involved in workshopping for a number of years. And it is with no pretense at modesty that I say I am an amazing story doctor. I write incredible critiques. I have the stack of student, testimonials to prove it. And I was in workshop today with people who I could tell their minds were blown, and I felt very smug, actually. So I'm excited to have the chance to do this with a Reading for Pixels donor.
That's right, and a donor who donates to get this critique session will have 20 pages of his, her, or their work in progress critiqued by Alex in writing via email, a chance to ask Alex questions about the critique in one follow-up email. If you're a science fiction and fantasy author looking for some expert guidance on your work in progress, here's your golden opportunity to get honest, professional feedback on your work. This is a rare opportunity because Alex rarely offers any critiques outside of the writing classes that she teaches. So far, we've raised $1,860 towards our $5,000 goal, and which is our slowest fundraiser yet. So please give generously before the fundraiser ends in October 2019. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. And if you're watching this session on YouTube right now, you will also be able to ask Alex questions live. Just make sure you're logged on into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the YouTube screen. And Sam, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me to read out to Alex to answer. And now, Alex, over to you.
Great. I'm starting tonight with a reading from A Daughter of No Nation, which, as you said, was the novel that won the Prix Aurora a couple of years ago. I started with this because as a choice that sort of thematically ties into the idea of violence against women. The first book in this series, Child of a Hidden Sea, is a portal fantasy. I sometimes tell people these books are Narnia for environmentalists or Narnia for grown-ups. The main character, Sophie, is a videographer, an ocean videographer from San Francisco, and she goes to this other magical world in search of her birth family. And one of the things she finds there is a culture that has very different standards of what is sort of a normalized level of violence. So she experiences violence for really the first time in what has otherwise been a very sheltered and privileged life. And then she gets kicked out of the country. She gets deported. She gets sent back to San Francisco, and she's trying to find a way to return to Stormrack. But she knows that doing that means she's going to be back in this culture where people routinely carry swords and often get in brawls, and she's decided that she needs to build up her tolerance for that and her willingness to engage in that kind of stuff. So this is where Daughter of No Nation begins. I'm just setting a timer so that I actually read as much as I said I would. Chapter 1. I'll turn so you can see me a little better. We're going to try this. The blonde woman had chapped fingertips with ragged, oft-gnawed nails, and she was half her attacker's size. His hand around her throat obscured it entirely. The padded glove bulged like a crash collar wedged between her chin and shoulders. He was making to drag her away when she let out a half-strangled shriek and stomped his left foot. It wasn't much of a blow, but he staggered and, better, hesitated. She jabbed an elbow into his ribcage, then wriggled free of his grip, mostly by virtue of falling at his feet. She scrambled away at a run, screaming at the top of her lungs, "No, no, no!" Once she reached the far end of the dojo, she spun, improvising a victory dance. The rest of the self-defense class bellowed approval from the sidelines. The foam-swaddled attacker, whose name was Mark, put up a hand acknowledging defeat. "Sophie, you're next." Sophie Hansa stretched, exchanged high fives with the blonde, and took her place on the mat. The class was meant to help women who might otherwise freeze in a fight, to get them past any retrograde, ladylike sense of hesitation over hitting someone. The idea was to make wrestling and punch-throwing more familiar and comfortable, to simulate the mock, and not so mock, fighting that little boys allegedly got into throughout childhood. "Okay," their instructor, Diane, said. "You're not expecting trouble. Where are you?" Sophie fought an interior sigh as a handful of improbable answers occurred. On a climb in Nepal, or in a yellow submarine. Aboard the great Verdanish sailing ship Breadbasket, in a world these earnest women would never hear of. But 6 sessions in this fluorescent-lit room, with its smell of feet and tension, had given her plenty of time to come to grips with the group's expectations. "Coming out of a bar. Drunk? Just tipsy. Where's your car?" "Parked in a well-lit..." Diane's role was to ask questions until Sophie at least half forgot Mark was back there. But this time he went for surprise by jumping in right away. The flat of his hand struck the small of her back. Sophie all but face-planted into the mat. "Roll!" someone shouted. It was too late to somersault back to her feet like some kind of cartoon warrior. She flung herself sideways instead, wheezing. He'd winded her. Mark was already pouncing, dragging her by her shoulder and a handful of her hair. Sophie turned her head sharply. It was enough to pull her curls out of the glove as she grabbed for his eyes with her free hand. She got a grip on the mesh mask, remembered she was supposed to be screaming, let out one breathless "No!" and went for the knee to the groin. And, briefly, she remembered trying a similar move on a bona fide monster, its hot, rotten breath and the slick of blood on the floor. Then she flashed on the sound of her aunt's neck snapping. Her knee came up, right on target, and it was a good hit, hard contact. Mark let her go, but didn't pretend to collapse. "We're over the line," he said. It was true. He'd yanked her over the white chalk smear, the imaginary boundary between life and death. Nice try, Sophie, but he got you, Diane affirmed as Sophie sucked air past the shards of glass in her lungs. Elkie, you're up. Yeah, Sophie thought, I'm quite the action hero. After everyone had had a turn, they practiced clobbering inanimate foam targets as hard as they could, yelling, commit, 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 with every blow. Then they stretched and debriefed on everyone's success in fighting off, or in her case, not fighting off, Mark. Go home and be safe, Diane said finally, a benediction and a dismissal all in one. The class was held in a San Francisco community center, a low-slung brick building painted with kids' murals. No ride today? A classmate asked as they stepped out into the parking lot. Sophie suspected her classmate had a bit of a crush on her brother. She'd told the woman Bram was gay, but her enthusiasm for him had not dimmed. Scanning the lot for her brother's car, Sophie shook her head. It's cool. I'll catch Bart as far as... A honk interrupted her. Her heart sank as she recognized her mother. Ambushed. She checked her phone, but there was no text from Bram. Regina Hanso was already cracking the passenger door. How did it go, she asked, as though they did this every week. Her mother had always favored car rides for parent-child heart-to-hearts. No escape that way. Sophie pressed herself inside through thick air. I got a few good shots in. They sat a moment in silence, her mother not going anywhere, not saying anything. It was a good tactic. Sophie could never let a silence stretch. How'd you find me? Bram's got that creepy stalker app installed on his phone. It shows your GPS location. You stole Bram's phone? Borrowed. Her mother held it up. Sophie managed to retrieve the phone without snatching it. I don't know what you're thinking, but I'm thinking that when your father and I came home from Sicily, you were limping and mopey. I don't mope. You finally defended your thesis, and then you turned down the job interview at the Scripps Institute. Then there's all the training. I just about convinced myself you wanted to apply to the space program. Instead, I find you taking, her mother's voice rose, self-defense classes. Mom, nobody's attacked me. Her mother unknotted slightly. She decided I'd been raped just as soon as she realized what I was doing here, Sophie thought. I'm sorry, she said. You weren't meant to worry. I wasn't meant to know at all about this, was I? Regina started the car and pulled out into the light fog. Where to begin? I'm taking the class because I'm filling time. I already told you I'm waiting to hear about a sailing gig, the one you can't tell us about. It's not the space program. I thought the self-defense class would be fun. This was the point where she should say yes, but Sophie was a rotten liar. Instead, she let her breath out in a woof. Useful? Like the extra math drills and the knot tying and the triathlon training and all the time you spend just looking at pictures of, I don't know, sea snails and apparently trying to memorize every single species in the ocean? A little training can never hurt, can it? Training for what? If it's not NASA and you haven't been attacked, are you expecting to be? This was getting uncomfortably close to the truth. Mom, watch the road. I found the pepper spray on your key ring. It's not like that. Well, it was. But hopefully that was a one-time outlier of a horrible experience. It's not enough that you jump out of airplanes and risk the bends and shark bites every time you go off to pursue your so-called videography career. Mom, please. More people are killed by cows every year than sharks. So you keep saying, but you're not a farmer, are you? If it's just a diving job, why the secrecy? Talking about the secrecy is still talking about it. If you joined the DEA or some other government agency, you wouldn't be taking community center anti-rape classes. You'd be at Quantico, learning to defend yourself properly with an enormous gun. Federal Agent Sophie, that's me. It wasn't a bad idea. Did Quantico have programs for civilians? It's not funny. Her mother was trying to wind her up. Get her babbling, play 20 questions. Then she could start mining out the truth as Sophie slipped and dropped clues. It was a good strategy. They both knew she was something of a motor mouth. But Sophie had promised, under the threat of having her memory wiped, no less. And the truth might hurt more than her silence. She could imagine her mother's face if she broke. I went looking for my birth parents. Can of worms or what? The temptation to spill it all rose, as it always did. It's an incredibly cool gig, Mom, and important, okay? But I can't talk about it. Says who? That would be talking about it, Mom. You used to tell us everything. Her patient snapped. Unlike you. What was it you'd say when I asked about the adoption? Confidentiality in this case is non-negotiable. Regina stamped the brakes too hard at a red light. A driver behind them honked as they both snapped up against their seatbelts. I would hate to think you've been waiting your entire life to say that. What if I was? 25 years ago, you do a closed adoption, and whatever I might want to know about it, it's just too bad. Isn't that right? Regina's voice was thready. We made a promise. Yeah, Sophie said. Gave your word, and too bad for me. Shoes on the other foot now, Mom. Her mother rocked in her seat, clutching the wheel. Sophie fought an urge to open the door while the car was stopped, to just run for it. She had never been at odds with her parents before. Her passion for climbing and diving made them anxious, but they'd worried quietly. Well, except for Dad hectoring her to finish her degree and do something worthwhile. Worthwhile, intellectual, safe. She stared at the dashboard, digging for something she could say that would help. But it wasn't just that she'd promised. Hell, she'd signed non-disclosure agreements and gotten multiple tiresome finger-wagging lectures on the subject. There'd been threats of jail, of magically wiping her memories even if she blabbed. Secrecy, secrecy, secrecy. In a way, the promises were beside the point, because telling the truth would land her in a facility for the profoundly delusional. She'd found her parents all right, and they weren't even from Earth. Now there's a supermodel on my damn porch. The change of subject was so jarring that it took Sophie a second to make sense of her mother's words. What? Captain Garland Parrish of the private sailing vessel Nightjar was sitting on their stoop. This was going to make things with her parents even worse. All the same, Sophie found herself smiling. If he was here, odds were good she was going back to Stormrack. So that's from A Daughter of No Nation.
That's right. That was nice.
Thank you.
So we'll proceed with our Q&A session.
Okay. Ask me Q's. I will A.
So let's talk about women and girls in
Okay.
your books and science fiction and fantasy in general. Your Hidden Sea Tales series features vibrant, memorable, and strong-willed female characters such as Sophie, her stepsister Verena, the mother Beatrice. What or who are your inspirations for your female characters?
Oh my goodness. When I came to write the Hidden Sea Tales, it was after I had written Indigo Springs and Blue Magic, which are a duology. And the main character in that pair, Astrid Leithwood, is a little on the Spocky side, and we have a joke in my marriage that I am the Spocky one and my wife Kelly is the Kirky one, meaning she's more emotionally expressive and more prone to tell secrets and more just more. She's just more. I'm more. Those are the Spock eyebrows. Sorry. So when I came to write the second thing, I wanted to try and push against my own natural tendency to be reticent and to create reticent protagonists. It's sort of one of the ongoing challenges I still face today as a writer. So I took a little bit of a leaf from Kelly's book, and her bam 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 have all the feels, show all the feels was a big starting point for me for Sophie. And then on top of that, the thing about my wife and about a lot of emotionally expressive women is they don't get any love for it in society. Like we don't value these qualities that we think of as feminine, like emotional expression. But they don't in any way negate strength. So one of Sophie's great strengths is that whatever she's thinking, she says. Whatever she's feeling, she expresses it. And if people don't like that, just basically too bad. So I started with that for Sophie. And then Verena is sort of a classic little sister who feels a little bit hard done by because the older kid's getting all the presents. So
Attention.
But she's also, unlike Sophie, she has trained as a fighter all her life. So in this physical world where Sophie is unaccustomed to violence and, goes to a world where people routinely kill each other with swords, and is like the best I can do is go to my community center and learn to take a punch. Verena is a world-class sword fighter. So I liked that tension. And then Beatrice is I think turned out to be one of the more interesting discoveries over the course of the series, because when Sophie first comes to her, Beatrice is her birth mother, she just flips out. And we sort of slowly start to see that part of this is a legacy from her own marriage, which was very psychologically abusive. But as the series developed, I kept finding these new upwellings of strength and mischievousness in her. And one of the first surprises with Beatrice was I realized her job in San Francisco is she works in a kids hospice. Because as far as I'm concerned, that's hardcore. When your day job is going to help little kids die, you're tough. So I sort of wanted that to sort of set against her apparent hysteria, which is another thing that women, get called down for. So you're being emotional, you're being hysterical. So she has that same quality that Sophie has, where everything she feels is out there, but then she goes to work and it's cancer patients.
Okay, that's interesting.
I don't think that's too
A Child
spoilery.
of Hidden Seas. Yeah, in Child of Hidden Sea, of a Hidden Sea, in particular, seems to be about women and girls reconnecting. Sophie trying to save the life of an aunt that she's never known, and then landing in Stormwreck. She's assisted by her sister, whom she has never met before.
Yeah.
So, why did you decide to explore the theme of women connecting and building relationships, ranging from family ties to friendships?
Oh, it was just long enough ago that I'm like, how did that all come about? I wanted to start with that sort of classic trope of the castaway princess sort of idea, and then really sort of interrogate it as a feminist. Like, what is it to feel as though you've been thrown away by your family? What happens when you meet them later and they don't want you? How do you retain your sense of who you are in the face of those kind of really potentially crushing identity questions? And a lot of my stuff has very complicated parent and sibling relationships in it. And it is in part because the family I grew up in was very complicated, as all families are. And, to this day, I'm still sort of, that family of origin is completely dispersed, but none of the people in it speaks to any of the others except me. And so I'm in this position as an older person of still trying to sort of balance the tightrope of being in touch with these very disparate people who don't actually get along or relate to each other, and are not a whole unit in the way that we think of families sort of traditionally. So it's sort of integral to my artistic process. There's usually a couple of interesting sibling relationships, and then a couple of sort of wildly problematic parental relationships.
Yeah.
And in Sophie's case, she's got 4, because her adoptive parents, who are wonderful in many ways, are also parents. So, they're imperfect.
Yeah. But that's what I truly enjoyed about the book was
thank you.
The detail, the microscopic detail that it went into in examining family ties. It was really, it was a good read. The next question, a positive and in-depth depiction of female friendships and relationships seem to be rare in most science fiction and fantasy books, though it has been getting better over the past decade. So why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, there was such a long period where if there was a woman in a book, there was a woman. So the prospect of that person having a female relationship was zero. And then as we sort of started beefing up the numbers, the temptation was always to make that person a rival. Like we sort of came into this idea of, we want women with agency and we want women with power. And then we kind of fell into that means they all have to be warriors kind of trope. And so we had, like in cinema, we had, for example, Ripley. She's the only one, and her big female relationships were with Newt, which was that sort of mother-child thing, which never got to be very complicated. And then with the mama alien, and that was kind of it. Um, and then you look at something more like Xena, and they were really interested in that besties relationship for a while, but they couldn't find anywhere to go with it that didn't get really operatic, where they both had to be moms and both of their kids had to be dead, and oh my god. And it's because I think there is still a tendency for some writers to empower a woman to a certain degree and then not know what to do with her, a woman character. I mean, they feel like I've given her all this stuff and now that's played out, and she either has to get sexually assaulted or have a baby and fade from view. So it excites me that we're starting to push beyond that, but it took a lot of sifting, I feel. Did I answer you at all there? I sometimes get so far down the road that I forget the original question. So
Sort of. I mean, it's more of why do you think that is, but I get what you're trying to say.
I guess the answer is I think it's evolving. I think
Yeah.
I think it's like a kid learning to talk. We learn to tell one story about women, and then we learn to tell a couple more. And we were probably telling them all along, but maybe society had to learn to hear them.
Makes sense. Yeah.
I like that answer.
We'll go with that then. Next bunch of questions. All genres have their shares of female stereotypes and tropes, and fantasy is no different.
Yep.
So, how do you break such stereotypes in to create a female character such as Sophie, who is smart and stubborn enough to deal with the sexism and misogyny that she encounters in her life and on her adventures?
With this particular series, I sort of drove into the tropes like I had a big truck and they were a target and I was just going to smash them. And I think I got a little bolder as I went. So by the time we get to the nature of a pirate, it's a tiny spoiler here. I mentioned the first one sort of starts with the thrown away princess kind of idea. By the time we get to the nature of a pirate, I'm like, I want to do something that is just right off like 1970s primetime TV. So I did the fake marriage, the sort of usually crime TV shtick where for some reason the female protagonist and the male protagonist have to go somewhere and pretend to be married or pretend to be engaged. And it's always for a very dumb reason. But I'm like, okay, I will make it for a really good reason. And then it always turns out like it's just sort of a shtick for we will pretend to threaten one or the other partner, and then we see that they love each other like a married couple anyway. And all the way through this particular book, the two of them are actually having a fight because Parrish believes in true love. He believes in love at first sight. So he's like, none of that is science. Like, that's just not how it is. And he's like, she realizes he's been making decisions based on the fact that he believes she is his one true love. And she's like, that is bananas. You cannot do that. I'm not even sure I love you. And he's like, you totally do. So that's what I try to do is I like basically try to take the trope and smash into it in a new, interesting way. Not everyone loves that, apparently.
Right.
But I feel the tropes are there to be explored and flipped.
Right. Sorry, I may have lost you there. Probably that's why there was a bit of a lull.
No, you can still hear me now, though.
Does placing Sophie in a world as different from ours and as complex as Stormwreck make it easier to break fantasy stereotypes and tropes regarding women and girls?
I think so. I think you take someone with a present day privileged North American background with the entitlement of sort of a educated white woman, and you throw her in a world where At least in Stormrock, there are 250 different island nations. So
Yeah.
one of the big things is no matter who you meet, if you're meeting a new person, a person from a new culture for the first time, you don't know. They could be anywhere on the spectrum. They could be keeping one or the other gender in seclusion, practically in slavery, and they do actually also have slaves on Starmark, or they could be like completely groovy and with it in a way that makes our culture look caveman-y and retrograde. So part of the play with that in this series is that every time there's a new person, there could be new rules. And then the various nations have a sort of United Nations at sea called the Fleet of Nations,
Right.
and they have sort of an agreed upon middle ground operating code that is sort of falls in the lines of mercantile capitalism / democracy, where things are a little more comfortable because nobody can be too much of a jerk to each other. And the slave nations have agreed that they won't actually transport slaves within the
Six.
fleet. And it's meant to be an uneasy compromise, as indeed this is how we all live here, right? Each nation has its own slight variation on inclusion or not, and to get along, we compromise in various ways.
That's true. Sounds like at some point we all have to come to an understanding on how to live in a civilized society.
Let's hope.
Okay, so this is something that's this question is actually really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
As we can see from the cringeworthy examples provided by the Men Writing Women hashtag, quite a number of SIS male authors have trouble writing women as real people.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you think that many science fantasy fiction authors still have trouble writing stories that pass the Bechdel test, despite the fact that there are so many more things that women talk about other than men?
Whenever someone fails in their characterization of any person, I really, that boils down to partly a failure of empathy and partly a failure to recognize that we are not all things. It's sheerly egotistical to imagine that you can just in your head, as a white able-bodied person, imagine all of the challenges facing, say, a person of color with a disability. And it's great that this is under negotiation now, which is what's happening, is we're having this conversation about just not making that assumption and doing extra work. And nobody loves extra work. I don't love extra work, but to address those shortcomings. But for so long, it has just been, if you are privileged enough to write, you are privileged enough to say whatever you please and speak for whoever you please. And because
Right.
no one loves extra work, like, I'm not saying I empathize with this, but if you're a dude writer born in the middle of the century and it's been okay to just slap any old heavily lubed woman on the page to sort of narc at her husband a bit about how he's ignoring her, and then send him off to the moon to do his moon thing, like, what incentive did those guys have? They weren't really writing for us. They were writing for other people like them.
That's true.
Again, not saying that's good.
What can you suggest to writers then who want to write female conversations and relationships realistically?
Well, I mean, the conversation we've been having a lot now is about sensitivity readers,
Right.
and the consensus that I feel I see is that if you've done the best you can and the character is not speaking about their experience of oppression specifically, then just do the best you can and try not to be an idiot. But if you're, say, a straight person writing specifically about the gay experience, then maybe you need a gay sensitivity reader. And maybe you should darn well pay for one. Sorry. and all of that applies across the spectrum of inclusivity that we've all been discussing so intensively. But something I say to new writers is write your truth. Write the best thing you can, because there's a lot to learn in writing. And always try not to be a jerk, obviously. But then do engage in the workshop process and do see what other people think. Because generally speaking, your readers will tell you, "Oh, I think there might be a problem here," and that is the first step to figuring out, do I need a sensitivity reader for this thing?
Right.
Is that?
No, that's actually a really good answer. It's like, think, research, don't just write.
And listen.
Yeah.
Think, research, listen.
Yeah.
They said.
So working on the premise that an author's gender can play a role in how well women and girls are portrayed in their books, has being a non-binary person influenced the way you write women and girls in your stories, while also helping with dismantling binary gendered roles and gendered stereotypes?
Yes. I was assigned female at birth, and I present female. So, anyone glancing at me who doesn't know me still default assumes that I'm a woman. I have a very good handle on the female experience, female oppression, life as a lesbian, and all of that. So, the challenge for me across gender is sometimes questioning whether, my masculine experiences are valid. And I've sort of chosen to come to the conclusion that they are, with the help of many other non-binary people, sort of exploring that. And in my more recent books, I've always written books that had a fairly high amount of gay in them. In fact, in some ways, the Hidden Sea Tales have less overt gay in them than my previous Indigo Springs and Blue Magic, and my current projects. But I was sort of continually trying to push people from different parts of experience into lead roles in my books, and to do that in a way that is human, that makes them human.
I like that answer. So we have one question from the audience. Nice, interesting question. Will you and your wife ever collaborate on writing a story?
I don't know. We're kind of agreed that at present we are not interested so much in doing that. And it's because what we see in our creative process right now is we're interested in a lot of the same things, and we research sort of in parallel tracks sometimes. But inevitably we'll be into something, we'll be super interested in it, and then there will come a moment where I'm like, this is the story I want to write about this, and Kelly's like, that doesn't interest me at all. This is the story I want to write about this. So for example, we were looking at an exhibit of Babylonian artifacts in the Royal Ontario Museum one day, and we came upon this statue of a Babylonian king with his monster killing stick. Like, and I was like, this could happen. Imagine, I mean, they really believed these were, there were actual monsters, and people assumed the king would be able to kill them if they showed up. And we were like, and I said, and this is the story I would write about that. And Kelly was like, no. Like, okay. And then she went on to write God, Monsters, and the Lucky Peach, which had many other things in it as well. But the Babylonian king in that, was inspired directly by that conversation. So in a sense, we help each other develop our ideas sometimes, but at present we're not sure we can agree on a story we're both really interested in.
Fair enough.
And we also, time travel is another good example. Her vision of time travel and God's Monsters and the Lucky Peach is very multiverse. You can never go back. Nothing you ever do in the past affects the timeline that you came from, kind of thing. And I have always been a big time travel freak, and I have always been interested in the quantum leap, kind of the universe you can change, the idea of the do-over. Part of what's interesting to me about time travel is that concept of regret and wanting things back that you can't have.
Right. I think that's a lot of people.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's part of the drive for a lot of people of time travel. And I'm a huge quantum leap nerd, so.
So, moving on to our next cluster of questions.
Mhm.
Depending on the places and cultures in Stormwreck that Sophie explored,
Mhm.
we see her run into some misogynistic characters in A Daughter of No Nation.
Mhm.
Um, but the male-female relationships in the book are generally quite equitable, and some of your male characters, such as Captain Parrish, are respectful of women.
Mhm.
So, do you think reframing how stories describe men away from that hostile and toxic stereotypes and towards complexity and even vulnerability can be one of the ways that fantasy fiction writers can break away from toxic tropes and promote toxic masculinity?
Absolutely. Parrish specifically was raised on an island of penitent monks, um, who are the one reformed pirate. There were 5 pirate nations, and 4 of them would still really like to go back to piracy, and the other one has gone all religious and they're sorry. So he was raised by like an entirely masculine community of monks who are very, very sorry for everything their ancestors did, and they spend their entire existences caring for the dead. So he's like just warped. Um, and then when he was a young man, he fell into being first mate on the ship, um, a ship owned by the Verdani. And the Verdani woman who owned it is from a culture that is matriarchal, and not entirely in good ways. Like it is matriarchy in the way that we have patriarchy. It's not as toxic, but it's not an equal society, and her culture is very. It's common for a woman of say 50 to take up with a 20-year-old dude. So everyone just assumes he's her boy toy. Um, so he's very talented and he's very open to things, um, and and he kind of had to be a worthwhile partner for Sophie, because one of the things about the strong female character trope, when you actually have an interesting nuanced woman, one of the things you also see writers struggling with is like, but then if we give her a dude, he's got to be an uber dude. um, I didn't want Parrish to be
That way.
superhuman, necessarily. I just wanted him to be good enough, and good enough is a high standard. Like we all deserve someone who is good enough. um, I think male characters in fiction have improved a great deal, but I also think men have improved a great deal. I think that the push against toxic masculinity in our culture, while it still has miles and miles and miles and miles and miles to go, um, has made some real inroads into how people, at least in my culture, behave. Because I see it in the different generational cohorts. I see younger men having more permission to be emotional and sensitive and to do emotional labor, and to parent, that older generations don't always feel is free to do.
Right.
And to talk about being feminists and actively do stuff like no guy in the era I grew up in would have necessarily at that time expressed feminism or attempted to challenge his peers on toxic beliefs. And I'm not saying they all do. Obviously, they don't. But many do, and that just I wouldn't have believed it when I was like 15.
So, just following from the fact that you just said, you know, we see men changing
Mm-hmm.
in that way. Do you think that eventually that the violent alpha male type character would phase out of science fantasy as cultures worldwide start kicking out toxic masculinity?
I would love to see that. I think we're going to hang on to that character as an archetype of villainy.
Okay.
Um, and I see we see certain things that we code as bad now being presented as villainous in ways we didn't necessarily as much in the past. Just as oh, okay, I'm so into what I'm saying that I'm like there are too many words and they can't actually all come out of my mouth at once. Okay, back up. Alpha male characters. I think we are already seeing a decrease in stories where the most important character is an alpha male who, when the chips are down, solves his problems by punching someone.
Right.
And I think more and more when we see a character in media or in a book who is an alpha male, who is clearly that sort, as readers or viewers, we're suspicious of them, and often it proves out that they are not a good guy. And we also see portrayals where that character is the old okay dad who doesn't get it, and they're contrasted with a younger guy who has different values. And like I think all of these are cultural symptoms of the change that feminism is trying to enact in the world. And it's heartening to see, but it's also frustrating because no amount of sensitive, warm, fuzzy television really offsets the fact that people still get killed and women still get raped and all of this violence still occurs globally. Like I watched a really heartwarming mystery show over the last couple of weeks. It's called Shetland. It's from the UK. And one of the things I really love about it is mostly they're trying to find a way to have an alpha male on it who isn't super toxic. And that's lovely. And maybe he's modeling for a new generation of viewers like that much. But it's so much easier to change media than it is to change the world.
Yep. That was very well put, despite the
Despite that raw.
Yeah. Stories are one of the most powerful ways of bringing about cultural change.
Mm-hmm.
The line between consent and coercion isn't always very clear in fantasy books, whether it's epic fantasy or urban fantasy. So do you think this is an issue with writers in the genre have started tackling successfully in recent years?
I think we're all finding our own way through it. And many of those ways are really interesting. And another thing I see in visual media, because I teach so much, I'm not always as up to date on what's on books as I should be or I would like to be, but I still see a lot of TV. But something I see in visual media is it's much more common now for a character to say, "Can I kiss you?" before they do. And
Right.
filmmakers are learning to find ways to make that really sexy. Again, like that just never happened when I was younger. Like the Han Solo just making Leia kiss him was just default. That was totally okay. She was into it. It's weird because we could imagine as creators writing things that always sort of had that sort of story arc where there's always consent and always respect, but as creators we're also wanting to depict these things that are still really awful and really violent, and to talk about the fact that we still live in a super violent world. So I write stuff sometimes that has explicit assaults and has murders and has sexual assaults occasionally, and it's interesting to do that in a time when we're having these conversations about, well, should rape ever be on stage in a book? Like, is that just sensational? What's the value of that artistic creation? So I'm very glad we're having the conversation, and I don't have all the answers.
No, I mean, sometimes we just reflect reality, right?
Yeah.
So, many people in the anti-violence against women movement say that male violence is the main, if not the root cause of violence against women and girls. And of course, violence in general. So how do you think stories and books like yours can help move this conversation forward in a constructive way?
I think as a creator, you try to create something that you know is honest and that you know you feel passionately about. And you try to make a good, solid, whole thing. And then you send it out into the world, and you never really know what seeds you are planting or what fruit they will bear. I watched an episode of The Art Assignment on YouTube yesterday, and I think her name is Catherine Green, said, like, once a painting is on a wall, the interpretation is unique to every individual who sees it. Like, it's not that the artist was sending a message. It's just a painting, and you take away from it what you want. And I struggle a little with that because, I'm writing books where I'm like, I'm not preachy, but I have ideas, and I would love it if some of my readers bought into them. So I'm like, am I just being a control freak? But for example, my newest book, which I wrote under a pseudonym, the pseudonym LX Beckett, is about climate change and about sort of a society that has had a huge throwdown about all of this stuff, inclusivity and male violence and guns and healthcare and who gets to eat and colonization. And the society is global, and it is currently quite stable. So it's kind of post-privilege, and it's kind of post-capitalism. And, deep down, what I want is for someone to read that book and go, oh man, I want to build a world that's at least as good as that. And I feel like I can see how. So that's hubris. I have hubris.
That's great. Just quickly though, Misty 306 has a question for you.
Oh, thank you, Misty.
So you believe in the butterfly effect?
I'm assuming you mean for time travel. I enjoy stories about the butterfly effect. Let me think about the last thing I wrote that had time travel in it. The last thing I wrote that had time travel in it, actually, I guess there are two of them. One of them is a horror story bought by Ellen Datlow on Tor.com called The Color of Paradox. And the idea is a little more brutal in that one. It is, you make a single change, and then you watch the effects sort of rocket up the timeline, and you hope they don't take you out. And then you assess, and then you make another really overt, brutal change. So yeah, the time travel construct I'm currently working with is more along the lines of, we're figuring it out, so we're using a sledgehammer. But being a big leaper, meaning a fan of the show Quantum Leap, like, one of the things that was really lovely about that was this idea that if you make one person's life better, that effect will ripple out, that the people in their lives will have better lives, and that there will be concentric circles of healing, basically, if you can stop a traumatic event. And I like that, right? Because traumas do ripple out.
That's true. Unfortunate fact.
Yeah.
So moving on, geek culture in general, including science fiction and fantasy, has had its share of critics saying it's still too male-dominated, despite a rising number of prominent and well-respected and well-known female authors, such as yourself. Plus, there is still plenty of hostile, misogynist, and sexist behavior by male geeks towards female geeks. So what do you think needs to be done to make geek culture as a whole more welcoming for women and girls?
I go back and forth on this. I have days where I'm like, just keep being good, just keep being optimistic, just keep making great, inclusive art, seduce as many as you can, and hope the rest of them all just sort of eventually lose their energy and wither and die. And then I have days where maybe I've been exposed to a news story that's particularly disheartening, and I'm like, this is war. Like, we need to start fighting this like it's a war. And I don't know if I even know what I mean by that, but I have days where I feel much more stroppy and combative, and something should be done, and it should be really, really invasive and fighty.
Bulldoze right into it.
Yeah. But at heart, that earlier vision is the one that I cling to. And I cling to it in part because despite everything that is happening in the world now, I believe we are winning. And I believe the rise of fascism that we've seen lately, and the attempts to steal elections, and the many frightening things, are a response to the fact that as the world becomes more inclusive, the people who have dominated it for so long can see the writing on the wall. And what that writing says is, you're not going to be special no more. And they're freaking out, and they're trying to hang on. And so I choose to believe that the difficult, inclusive, consensus building, less violent, non-cheating at elections path is somehow going to prevail, even though sometimes it is, there are days when it's really hard to keep the faith.
Oh, optimism.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are the final two questions that we have. One of it is a very Captain Obvious question. So you've been very incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. Mm-hmm. Why do you support the cause to end violence against women?
Why do I support the cause to end violence against women? As I said, I live in the world, as far as any stranger can tell, as a woman. I have experienced violence myself. I don't know if I know a single woman who hasn't experienced violence. And I don't mean catcalls, from across the street. I mean, right. Every woman I know has experienced violence. And we pretend this is an intractable problem, and yet 51% of the population could make it go away tomorrow by just cutting it the F out. And I think we forget that sometimes. I think we imagine that people can't not be violent. But I manage it, right? I'm sometimes super mad and super frustrated with people. And I don't delude myself that I could get away with punching them and then get what I want. I worked as a crisis worker in shelter for a time. I heard a lot of women's stories. It's a really worthwhile fight, and one that simultaneously makes you angry every day. But again, also, it's very rewarding work. And I'm just so grateful that the Pixel Project is charging into that fray right now. Because, the smallest things you do, even like the Twitter feed with the crisis numbers, that's so important, and it saves lives.
So what do you think, as authors can do to help with cultural change to eradicate violence against women and girls?
I think we use our platforms to talk about it. I think when it is part of our truth, we write about it or we make art about it. I think we don't condone it in our communities when we know that someone has been violent. We take steps to make our community safe. And if that means exposing them and making them a little sad because their career has changed, well, wah. I think we try to imagine and live in a world where male violence is not acceptable.
Right. Well, that's the best we can do, right?
Yeah.
One final question, though, from the audience, Misty.
Hi, Misty. What am I reading right now?
Yes, what are you reading right now?
It's quite violent, actually. I'm reading Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. This is a lesbian necromancer novel in space. I'm probably telling you something you already know, and I can't show you the cover because I spend so much time typing novels that I can't actually hold one in my hands for very long, so I use an e-reader. And I know that the next thing I will be reading is The Future of Another Timeline by Annalee Newitz. And I'm immensely excited about that. I know Annalee, and I have heard them talk about this book, and I'm like bananas to read it, but I have to finish Gideon the Nine first because it's so good. So those are the two things I'm reading right now. In addition to that, I am reading the work of 7. No, I can't do that on the camera correctly. 7 masterclass novelists at the UCLA masterclass that I'm currently teaching, and they're amazing books. I've been working with them for over 9 months, and I'm like, they're becoming so good, and I hope they all get published so I can tell you all about them. And I have a class of science fiction writers at U of T who are also writing exciting new things. So I'm reading
That's
all of
great.
that at the same time.
That's a lot.
It really is. It really is.
So, you've been so grateful, and just want to say thank you to everyone for attending, and to Alex as well. So I just have to put myself back on screen for announcements. Alex has so generously donated a couple of awesome goodies to the stash of our author goodies. We have up as perks for donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page, including, so you can show the books again, Alex.
Oh, okay. Are they on? There's
Yes,
the daughter of
there we
relation. I
go.
think it just works better if I just do one at a time.
So that's goodie number 1, The Hidden Sea Tales, first edition
And
book
there's
bundle.
The Nature of a Pirate.
So yes, Alex has put together a first edition hardcover book bundle for one US or Canada-based Read for Pixels donor, including a personalized copy of A Daughter of No Nation and a personalized copy of The Nature of a Pirate. This book bundle is the perfect gateway to Alex's series and an intense and thoughtful read for donors looking for imaginative and beautifully written books that tackle issues ranging from women's rights to climate change head on. There is only one of this book bundle ready for you to get your mitts on, so just donate $75 and Alex will get busy signing and personalizing them and sending them directly to you. Goodie number 2, as mentioned, Alex will critique 20 pages of your work in progress. So the donor who donates to get this critique session will have 20 pages of his, her, or their work in progress critiqued by Alex in writing via email, a chance to ask Alex questions about the critique in one follow-up email. So if you are a science fiction and fantasy author looking for some expert guidance on your work in progress, here's your golden opportunity to get honest, professional feedback on your work. This is a rare opportunity because Alex rarely offers any critiques outside of the writing classes which she teaches. Apart from that, we also have plenty more author goodies available from authors including Adrian Tchaikovsky, Alison Goodman, Alma Alexander, Anna Smith-Spark, Laura Ann Gilman, Hilary Monahan, and Sarah Langan, Bradley P. Bulliu, David D. Levine, Marshall Ryan Maresca, Nikki Drayden, Richard K. Morgan, and Nicholas Eaves. We also have a special auction featuring some rare books from horror maestro Stephen Graham Jones, books so rare that you can't even get them on eBay. So we've raised so far $1,860 towards our $5,000 goal, which is our slowest fundraiser yet. So please give generously before the fundraiser ends in October. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. And you can also donate to get these goodies. Let me just screen share. Okay. Yeah. So you can also donate for goodies via Rally App at http:/r4p Rally App 2019. Bid on Stephen Graham Jones's first edition books at http://bit.ly/SGJ Charity Auction 2019, or find out more about Read for Pixels. at http://bit.ly/readforpixels. All of these links will also be shared in our YouTube chat box. And so to find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it, visit the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. And Alex, if you have anything to say, any announcements to make.
Well, I will totally take the opportunity to show you all Game Changer because it is newly out. It is feminist, climate change fiction. It's optimistic. It's all the things I was just talking about. It's basically how we survive the future and live in a world we still want to live in and kind of recognize. My book launch is tomorrow in Toronto. So if you happen to be watching this and you're in Toronto, it's at Back of Phoenix Books at 3 p.m. I will be at CanCon in Ottawa in a couple weeks if you're going to CanCon. And I'm launching it in Vancouver at the end of the month. Well, actually, at the beginning of next month, in November 5th. And all of this is something you can find on my Lex Beckett Twitter feed, LXBECKETT. And that is Beckett as in Sam Beckett, because I am that big a Quantum Leap fan.
All right, so we've reached the end of our session. So thank you and have a good day or good night wherever you are in the world.
Thank you so much for having me.